Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. I'm Kristof from Tomme, and together with my co-host Marc Burgauer and our guests, we explore how deliberate complexity, social practice theory, and a deeper understanding of socio-technical systems can transform our organizations and the world we live in. This is the second part of our interview with Kenny Baas-Schwegler, a strategic software delivery consultant and software architect with a focus on socio-technical systems. Kenny blends IT approaches like domain-driven design and continuous delivery with conflict resolution methods like deep democracy. He facilitates organizational change through a range of visual and collaborative modeling practices like event storming, Wardley mapping, and context mapping. We have split this interview into two episodes. In the first episode, we discussed the role of domain-driven design and complexity awareness in Kevin's work. In this episode, we'll hear how Kenny started using methods like deep democracy and explore further why most organizational change efforts fail.
You were earlier talking, you only used the word once, but in a context, you talked about promise. I just sort of quickly go fish. Is promise theory something you apply?
Not yet. I read the second book, so the one from I think O'Reilly, we're trying to see how does that fit with the whole bounded context thing, because bounded context is really about responsibilities, and I'm now looking and each culture have different wording there. So if I come and say this is a problem that you're solving, we don't have problems here, we have challenges, right? Okay, that doesn't work. So I go to outcome or I go to responsibility, and I'm looking for how does promise fit in there. So me and a couple of colleagues are trying to take promise theory and see how that applies to the domain-driven design space of bounded context. So I think it can neatly fit, but I'm not so well familiar with the content yet, unfortunately.
Okay, you mentioned O'Reilly. So I know from Marc who initially came up with it. And so what I like about it in terms of so conflict is a relational issue, yeah. And so what I like about promise theory is how it reframes relational issues in exchanges. Yeah. So you making a promise means you have an intention, you'll go to best endeavors, but equally we know promises wouldn't need promises if keeping it was guaranteed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it implies that there is a potential of failure. And by that, so to me, it makes it human. Yeah. It takes away the mechanistic assumption that these are just gears that need to fit together, but it also reframes how the conversations are conducted once you start talking about promises. So that's why I was curious.
I'm looking into it. So the book I was referring to, he has the first book, which is with an interconnected part. Then he wrote a second book, and that one I've read, and I'm gonna read the first one as well. The second book is a more, I think, more clear, more condensed story on promise theory, and that I think he wrote for O'Reilly alone. Okay. I think the first book is together with someone, which name I forgot. Yeah,
I can't recall it either. Also, I have to admit, I started the first book, but I then came across Jeff Sussness' articulation of promise theory, found that far more applicable and digestible. So I've stuck with that. Never finished the first book, but maybe we'll have a go at the second book.
That's I wrote down Jeff, so I'm gonna look up that book. Yeah, but I see how it applies because DDD talks about strategic patterns and what are the what are the models and teams have in relationship with each other, which is also an interaction. So I just want to see how that model fits into the whole strategic pattern DDD model. So that's my take on it.
This book is Designing Delivery, just in case.
Cool.
I have a question. So we originally wanted to do this together with Evelyn, and she has a social, I think she has a social background like a social science background. Do you also have a social science background?
No, but I have a wife with a social science background.
Okay.
My wife studied anthropology as a bachelor, and then conflict studies and human rights. She has 2 masters in social science and law as well. So, and I always call her the natural social scientist. So she's like sort of, I don't know, she can go into a room and observe if people are mad or not. I'm like really looking up to it. So everything I talk about social science, I actually learned from her and from Evelyn by working with Evelyn. So I find it fascinating because it helped me a lot with the facilitation and stuff. Yeah.
So how did you get started then in this field? Did you come from more a software background or?
Electrical engineering. Actually.
Oh yeah, that's right. You said so. Yes, that's right.
Which was half software and half hardware, and then I figured out hardware was really so imaginary numbers and everything and calculating things, and I'm like, yeah, I can do this, but I don't enjoy it. So I went into the software and got into a company, a large insurance company, but I was on the asset management side as a software engineer. And from there, I just got a chance after chance and mentoring and coaching. And that was really important to me from also a social perspective already. Mm-hmm. And then I think 8 years ago, I met my wife, and then she started to get me interesting. So I started reading a lot of books from 2 Dutch anthropologists who do the corporate anthropology. And I just have the best feedback loop ever, because if I go out and I observe things or things happen and I go back, I can discuss it with my wife, and she's like, well, from a theory, blah, 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 and from this, blah, blah. So that's my learning path, and I'm really privileged to have my own teacher at home. So that's how I rolled in sort of the social part, because I was doing domain-driven design, because I learned that from that first organization. Like I saw already ambiguity in language, and so I picked up the book, I started learning, I started applying, and then event storming came in, and I started doing event storming. But for some reason, I figured out, well, there's a lot of social things coming up here. So, and then meeting my wife, getting into this, starting to look for conferences or places where I can learn more. And then I got to know a lot of people in the community that talk more about this. And then I met Evelyn 3 years ago talking about cognitive bias. So I said, well, let's work together. So my company where I worked, our consultancy company, took a step in the deep and hired her. And another part of the company hired a different organizational, behavioral scientist. And now it just worked, and they're part of our consultancy now, which I really enjoy working together on this stuff.
It's interesting to hear how shared libraries can shape our worlds. So yeah.
Oh, you didn't mean technical. You mean book libraries.
Yes.
No, and this is interesting because I try to read up on, and there's been conference talks about this as well. So pure social science books, right? Also, I took my wife books from her study and lead her start reading some of these, and that really helped me become a better facilitator and see, okay, how does this help me in my role? Because I don't want to become an anthropologist, but I want to learn how what they see and how I can apply it to my field and strengthen my own field in that, and especially working in between teams. It's that social and technical part, right? They interact with each other, and now I can see why most organizational change don't work, because they either change maybe only the process, right? Sometimes they only change the technical part. Sometimes and now I know they interact with each other and why it doesn't work and what the problems are there, and start listening to why it doesn't work.
Could we frame this as usually change is focused on the parts of the system instead of actually the relationship of the parts in the system?
Yeah, so it's not focused on the interactions. Matthias Veres made a nice post about the inverse Conway that they call it, right? But it's not on top of the back of the mind, but the gist was mostly if you in the past created a really a design, so you designed your software system really rigid, and you try to only change your team, like some people say, right? We change our team, so then hopefully the software system will change with it. But it's an interaction both ways, right? So it doesn't necessarily can go well. You sometimes also need to change your software design or architecture with it. You cannot just say, well, I formalize my teams in a different way, so I'll formalize, so the software architecture or design will change. You need really good strategies to actually do that, in my opinion, especially when you're working on big balls of mud that's been there for 8 years. And that's really, you need to form a strategy of how they create new boundaries or how they work, because they're still, well, interacting with each other on a daily basis on the code. And maybe the code will change a bit, but also the organization on top still demands in a certain way, forcing you back in that rigidity of that thing. So it's not always a good thing to do. And the company I'm in now has a big ball of mud that's 6 years, so you cannot do it there. It's really hard to tackle that one. But the ones I'm working on is a monolith that is turning into a big ball of mud, and there it can actually work, right? But I give them a proper strategy to let them pick between 3 tactics, saying, okay, if you pick up a new user story, because I don't want to close the shop. So I tell them, okay, you're moving towards 2 teams. It's going to be chaotic, right? It's complex. But here's the strategies you can work with dissecting that monolith / big ball of mud. And every time we can have a trade-off if you do it the way you're already building it, or moving towards that new architecture. And let's check the trade-offs at each new section, right? And then you see it working where now they're forming their own boundaries within the same code base. By the way, this is a Ruby on Rails world, where Ruby on Rails already enforces you to create a big ball of mud. By the way, I figured out, because my background is in Java and C# or C++. So it's already enforcing that to build on top of the model. So now I'm giving them boundaries, and now you see them already negotiating, right, between the code base, when to move something out, when to leave something in. And that interaction, I'm focusing really on the interaction and the boundaries instead of how the process change. I don't really care how they do it. That's for them to solve. It's like I'm starting checking the signals, right? If I hear something in Slack, I see a conversation going on, I say, hold on, now I need to put these people back together in the room and let them start talking. And they figure that out for themselves, and now they're changing the interaction. And that it works, but I don't think this approach will work on that 8-year-old big ball of mud, because that's a whole lot harder to tackle. So you need a proper strategy and execute that strategy, because else you make it even more worse. I see that working inside a lot of organization, where the first thing they do is create an event stream, right? A proper business event out of that big ball of mud, create a new sort of service or bounded context, whatever you want to call it. And that's their start, and halfway they stopped it. But they never executed, and we call it the umbilical cord, and never cut the umbilical cord together properly. So now they're even in a worse situation, and we call it, well, the black hole just swallowed another one of your services back in, right? And in DDD terms, they call it the bubble context, right? The bubble context is like, okay, we're creating a new bounded context next to it, still using the old system, so old database. And that's the really cheap investment to create a new proper domain model. But eventually you want to go to the autonomous bubble. If you leave that open, the bubble will burst and it will become one thing again. And that's what usually is lacking, is if there's too much focus on delivering features, you need to have a a proper person, an architect in between that says, no, we need to finish this. How are we going to do it? Else in 3 months, you'll be in a worse situation. So that's a bit about, and that's a bit about changing the interaction instead of the parts itself.
So the interesting, what I'm hearing is that you help teams that are like, it's not a team necessarily, it's somewhere, like as you said, so it's in between scopes. But it sounds like most of the time you're in between the team and then the immediate layer above, or like you're dealing with like one part of, or one distinct part of the system, like a big ball of mud or a monolith or something like that. Do you have experience helping organizations like building a platform as in Jay Bloom's scope economy, like an economy of scope and really structuring the whole domain model? Do you have experience doing something like that?
A bit, but not in the long run yet. A colleague of mine is more working on that. I like to tend to sit in between business and so the users and the IT. So really where domain-driven design, well, domain-driven design is on the large-scale systems as well. But I really like to still work with the code and the team and see, okay, the impact we're making on a more strategic, domain-oriented scope. How does that affect the software, and try to sit in between, so to see the signals and push that back to the engineering manager scope, or to that level of work, as Elliot Jacques says, right? And then you have, I don't generally sit on the higher levels of scope where you, well, where what Jay Bloom also says, you do more of the really strategic Wortley mapping. I don't have exact experiences. I talk that, and I try to be the, how do you say it, the one translating it towards the, well,
conduit.
Yeah, so I'm more the facilitator in between, because I like to be in that situation and see the signals inside the team. As I said, tomorrow I still like, the reason I got into this point is that because I was a developer, I love to put code in, but I always got annoyed by that higher levels of scope, sort of say, higher level of work, where it impacts me as a coder, and I'm like frustrated. Why are you doing it? Okay, I'll handle that, right? So that's why I'm still in between, and I love still doing code. However, unfortunately, I don't do a lot of code anymore. But as I said, tomorrow I'll do some Ruby on Rails pairing where I won't code because I'm much too slow compared to these people that can just. But if you give me Java, C#, I can still. But I cannot keep up with Java 14 and .NET 5. I don't know, but I still love to see what is this decision impacting the code on that lower level, and vice versa. I love that feedback loop, and try to make that feedback loop faster, right? Because that's what I think is usually lacking. There's a decision being made strategically, and how's that feedback loop coming back on the team? And I can make that, I can translate that, because I know of both worlds, sort of say, and that's my sweet spot. So, long answer to to a short question. No, I don't have that, but I love to do what you see Suzanne Kaiser is doing with Wortley mapping towards moving towards using team topology and DDD and combining that. And a lot of in the DDD community is doing that, right? We're doing some Wortley mapping, and how can you drill down towards the teams and towards the bounded context the teams are working on, and how can we categorize subdomains on it? I do like that content. I think it's very valuable. I think that's where we're moving, and that's what my colleague João Rosa is doing, right? Sitting with C-level, doing Wortley mapping, doing more team topology with the engineering managers, and then how does that impact the teams, and how do you need to change the teams based on that? I'm very interested with that, but there's all these nice books as well, right? And then you need to pick one. You need to focus on one.
Oh, it's fascinating.
So you earlier actually pointed out a conflict that I also experience a lot. So on one hand, you're coming in an organization due to your technical expertise as an architect. But equally, we have now said what you actually have to change is relationships, not things, as in, yeah, we can tell them a bit about things, but as soon as we leave, that will evolve anyway. So that's not the sustainable change. The change is if we're reframing the relationship. And then you pointed out actually really nicely that what you're actually doing is facilitation. But so the conflict that I often experience when I facilitate is also, so we have an expertise, yours is architecture. How do you balance then? So as an architect, you obviously have opinions. You see what the current architecture is. You will probably understand why some of the constraints that the current architecture exerts on the team is holding them back, what could be moved to enable them. But as a facilitator, you obviously need to focus on relationships, so almost take a stand back from the architecture itself and say, so how's the socio-technical system as a whole? Yeah, how is it maybe not working as well as it could, and what can I do as a facilitator to start making these relationships better? So how do you handle these conflicts, and how
the conflict between I have an opinion and I need to stay neutral, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's the conflict. Yeah, I try to balance it to see what the need is. So and a perfect example one time in a different organization is from, and my colleague Joao Rosa were the interim CTO. I was like, okay, from there, it was like, we need to hire more people. And then we looked at the current tools or frameworks being used, and they're like, well, this we cannot use this. We need to go more market fit, right? So can you handle that, please? Okay, so I go to the teams and then we said, okay, we need a new front end framework. And looking at the market, there's two. There's Vue.js and there's React, which we can market or recruit better on, right? So that's concerning nice strategy. And then I go to the team, which was more of a media team, a few people. And I just asked them the question, these are the two frameworks. What do you need from me? And say, yeah, I need to get experience with it. Okay, is there a feature we can start working on? Yeah, this one. Okay, build that small feature out in both frameworks and see how they feel. Okay, and then the guy returned, and the two other developers were like, yeah, I'm not really. The few others said, well, he can decide. Well, that puts that person into a rough situation, right? Because all of a sudden he gets the pressure of deciding which one of the two for the future of the company. But at least I give them the chance. And I noticed as a facilitator, I noticed, because I couldn't care, because I wasn't, in that case, I have my opinion, which was one better, in this case, React. And his opinion was more Vue. So that already conflicted. But I said, I won't vote because, first of all, I'm a consultant. I can't vote for this because it's you that need to do it. But I saw his hesitation. And then I said, I can imagine that it's hard for you to take a decision. And then I paused because and then he said, yes, I don't want to be the guy who choose for a framework that all people in the future will hate on me, right? And that's a proper emotion, right? It's like I would have the same thing. And you hear these stories a lot where people jump in and jump to conclusion, oh, who figured this stuff out? It's an idiot. And it's like, no. Okay, so I created ADRs for that. And I say, okay, what are the trade-offs? And then then he showed to the rest of the group his solution. Said, now we're going to take a vote. And this is a deep democratic vote, right? I say it will be a vote. It will be a majority. And then actually the other people voted for React while he was for Vue, and he was the only one voting for Vue. So it was like, well, 10 against 1. And I say, okay. And then there's, from Deep Democracy, we say there's one important question to ask you, right? We made the decision. It will be React. But what did he need to go along with React? And he said, well, yeah, I've more worked with Vue, so I need some training. Okay, then we'll make sure you get training for React. And that's a way of sometimes getting back and saying, okay, I will take the lead now for you. you're fine, and I'll make sure that there will be a decision from the group and that the group is there. So I create an ADR and say, these people, all these 12 people were there. These people voted. This was the voting. And this is and that was the ADR setting there. So from now on, it's the group decision instead of one person's decision. And that's how I dealt with that conflict in a way, right? So, but it's a balancing act. And I had this discussion with a colleague today. How do you do that as leadership? So from a deep democracy sounds like it's all democratic, right? But no, some decision, you cannot make a democratic decision with 100 people. It's hard. Maybe you can, but it's hard. So deep democracy has 4 ways of moving into a decision making. It's like the fully democratic. This is the problem. Let's figure it out. Second one is, we have a problem. I already thought about it. I think this is a good idea. And then there's a third and the fourth one. The third one is like the proposition. I've worked this out, this proposition, because this has high priority, and you give good rational thoughts. And then you say, this is it. If you cannot give me a solid reason why not to do this, then we're going to do this. And then you have to command, we're just going to do it. But in each case, it's always important to ask, what do you need to go along with this decision? But also be clear on which one of these ones you pick, in my opinion, right? So if I've seen a lot of leaders coming in with me. One time someone did that and he said, well, Kenny, what do you think? And I was like, okay, he wants my opinion, right? In the end, I figured out he already made his decision. So I'm like, well, don't do this to me. If you make a decision, tell me you make a decision, because you can make that decision, right? This person was my hierarchical, higher ranked person. Make that decision, but ask me what I need. It's really disrespectful if you already know what you're going to do and then ask people, oh, but what do you think? No, you made the decision, clearly communicate that decision. And that's for architects. I still think if, as an architect in between the teams and trying to fit the systems together, you still sometimes need to make decisions for the team. Because, and I think Ruth, and I think this was from Ruth Malan, she said, right, you cannot expect the parts, the autonomous parts, to make decisions that eventually lead up by them fitting together, just by being the consultant. So sometimes you need to make rough decisions, because it can be decisions that is not so nice for one of these parts. These are the hard decisions, but you want to make the system fit together. And then you can still make that decision, but also manage from what do you need to go along. First of all, you need to very carefully explain it, right? So probe, what do you think if this happens? So then you can catch the net, and then you can come up with a really nice proposal that people can say, okay, yeah, this sucks, but I can agree. But also let that be, in my opinion. Usually then people say, yeah, I'm really pissed off about this. Okay, just be pissed off. That's fine, right? Be pissed off. If that's what you need, shout, be angry, be sad, and I won't fix that problem, right? It's their feeling, and that's the psychological safety. And then ask, okay, right, but what do you need? I know this is sad, and that's how I deal with it. So sometimes really taking that architectural decision, because sometimes people also want leaders or want to be managed, right? So I love it sometimes when some people just say, Kenny, we're going on holiday. This is where we're going. And I know you love this and this and this. Let's just do it. So I'm like, okay, fine. And that's what I see a shift now going to it needs to be the groups deciding, but sometimes it's such a guilty pleasure to just not need to decide and just follow along with the path, and someone decided it for me. It's fine. Right, so that's how I balance the two.
So I want to give a contrasting view to what you described there, because to me this sounds more like a catalyst rather than, what we classically understand as leader in organization or leadership in organization, which is a term, by the way, that
ambiguous.
I find terribly muddy and absolutely not helpful anymore. So I usually
true
leadership. articulations have become so commonplace that they have no meaning anymore. But so that's why I'm looking for other things. So catalyst becomes an enabling constraint, according to Alicia Herrero, by helping closing feedback loops. Yeah. So first of all, you are part of the system, so you are one of the parts, but you are not same as the other parts. Yeah. Because as a catalyst, what you're actually trying to make happen is a sort of system interaction. So you have described how you catalyze decision making, but equally immediately how you listen to the feedback and through that moderate the catalyzing. And so a system becomes stable in that sense, or a new system interaction becomes stable in that sense when the system starts to reproduce the catalyzing. And even that is what you described. So I think it's not leadership or imposing solution. It's literally you probe, as you said.
Yeah.
This is like a catalyst being introduced into a system, sort of, what's happening now that I'm here? Yeah. Oh, some new interactions are happening. What's the feedback? Yeah. Or if the feedback loop closes so that this starts to be repeated, then also the people that you do this with, they will learn, oh, this is what happened. And even when you leave, they can continue doing this. Yeah, they say, okay, let's try it. Okay, we don't know which of these two solutions we want to pick. Well, let's go into a small thing with both solutions, see how we feel, and then have a decision. That's something that people can immediately pick up and run with. Yeah, so I really liked it how you described it, because this is really, I think, how we deal with complexity.
And I really like the word catalyst, because I once saw an entire Twitter thread about leadership with a friend of mine, Trond. And no, I'm against leadership. And then I found out he was meaning the hierarchical manager as leadership. And then then I agree with you. And it's becoming totally ambiguous. And the way I just described it is the catalyst, right? Someone with leadership skills, but not per se being the one that's hierarchical higher than them.
Yeah, which is also why I wish we would start distinguishing between acts of leadership. So I like Edgar Schein's definition, because he basically says it's emergent. Yeah, it's just somebody happens to do something that enables other people to follow. And he says real leaders emerge so that you can't anticipate where they come from, who's that going to be in the act of leadership, versus people in authority who have been tasked with executing authority in the sense of the buck stops here, or this is something we expect you to do. So we're throwing everything in this leadership, but okay, so this is also just my opinion. The reason this is not getting clarified is because there's a lot of money to be made in leadership coaching, and leadership advice. So you have whole conferences where all they're talking about is allegedly leadership, and if you look at the program, you can see the big ball of mud. No, they don't know what they're talking about. They're mixing metaphors all the time. But it gives you these. So people like being seen as talking about leadership because it attracts that higher level of pay and status within the organization.
And that's what's in one of my customers I'm helping as well, right? I'm helping the team, but I want to eventually that they do it themselves. So I started talking with their engineering managers and with the architects. Okay, we need to make sure the teams start doing architecture. They come from a place where they had tech leads, but that gives instant ranking. And people started looking at them like, okay, but you're the architect, take a decision. Okay, that's not what I want. So what I did was doing the same here, coming in, and then I saw some of these members or some of the team members starting asking me, but who took the decision? I say, you did. Me? No, you as a team took the decision. Yeah, but it wasn't nobody, no. And I said, that's the beauty, because you all did it. And then I started talking about the way I see and the way we want to set up architecture in the teams. And now they're all like, oh, that's what I want. And but now 3 people want it. And they're like, but there can only be one, right? I said, no, please not. No, you can all 3 start doing architecture. And I would rather love that than only one person, because then we're back to the single thing. And that's what's going on there. And now they're all in a state that they're taking that part there where where it's also flexing to the left, right? Where the PO came up and say, well, they took a decision functionally that I don't agree with. I said, yeah, fine. For now, it's in an autonomy boundary because it's in the system. So we can change it later on if it doesn't work. But let them roll for now, because I like it that they took their own decision for the product. That's what I want. And now they will get feedback from you and you say, well, this doesn't work. Fine. That's great. But at least now I see them changing what you're saying, cataclysm themselves in the system. And I haven't heard that work, but I know of her work. I love the constraints as an innovation talk she gave. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay.
This is also my metaphor I always use as a consultant. When I go in, I always say, okay, what does it take for me that you will kick me out? Right? What does it take? Because I don't want to be fixed or stuck in your system. I want to get out. I want to make, to change the phrasing, right? I want to be that catalyst. And then then that the system will change and I can leave the system, but the system will continue working as you want it to be. That's the first thing I say, because I don't want to end up here being 3-4 years and, then I might as well just join you, right? I'm a consultant. I want to help the change that you want me to help, and then move out. I don't want to be stuck inside the system and get swallowed there. Or I move, but then I'm not a consultant anymore. I'm not sure if that matches with the catalyst thing yet. I need to look it up a bit more. But
okay, so natural systems. So where you create these new interactions with catalysts, then the system starts to reproduce the catalyst itself by itself. Yeah, so it becomes a product of the new interaction. But if we want to use it as a metaphor, then I still think what you're saying is holding. So they have to figure out how to make these interactions sustainably happen once you leave. Yeah, so if you would need to be there, this was like a system that would constantly have to feed the catalyst from the outside.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going now deep. So autopoiesis is the underlying principle here. That would require that the system produces the catalysts itself, and so that's what you see in nature. So initially it's there from the outside, but then it's reproduced by the system.
But I see that happening, right, where they will do the same interacting and sort of like mimicking them in a way, but different. So become the catalyst themselves. Is that what you mean, right? So they're now doing the same thing, right? Reproducing what I'm doing in a way.
So it's, for example, it's a tech lead or an architect, actually, instead of demanding a solution. Yeah, so here's the problem, I decide. Actually learns from you how to facilitate the team and uses their expertise to help the team coming up with an opinion. Which then also ties into, it's a complex problem, so the more people look at it, the better the solution that we're going to find.
Yeah, and that's what you see. I just give them practices as well, right, to use on a different situation. So they're saying, well, we're going to have 3 solutions. Well, just do a pro-con fix list now. Let's keep it simple for now. And if you don't, usually you get to one of the 3. Okay, this is the one. If you don't, just try both of them because it's too complex. Okay, do it. And so without going back to the previous question, without talking about complexity, I'm trying to help them deal with it in a way without really saying what complexity is, so to say. But just saying we need to experiment, right? The experiment or...
I'm the same.
Because unknown unknowables, or unknown unknowns, sorry, not unknowables.
I even stopped explaining Cynefin. So if people come to me, once you work with them and start describing problems, where I say, okay, now you have now discovered complexity, you just don't have lingo for it, then I might start showing that. Yeah. But I for a while, I did early in any agile or lean training, I would do Cynefin and just never saw it take traction, because you need to have experience of complexity and start to understand, so have the phenomenon in front of you that you can't otherwise, get your grips with before people actually are receptive for this kind of language. And so hence I'm totally with you. Let's give them some practice, and that's the whole approach of maturity mapping and the practice theory lens is let's give them something that that's very actionable and relatively easy for them to adapt, rather than confusing them with a lot of theory.
And that's what you see back in the domain-driven design community as well, right? You have the blue book, which is a large pill. I have it here, and people say it's theoretical. But if you go to the conference, we do hands-on continuously in the trainings. You do hands-on because it's pragmatic. You get practices, and that's a good thing about, for instance, DDD. I love is that it's not a bounded framework like, for instance, Scrum. It accepts different methods or practices or patterns. The problem there is that people come in and they say, okay, well, now what? So we give a bit of guidance, but it's practice. We don't tell you how to do it. It's like, these are the set of practices, principles, and let's be pragmatic about it. And I give you that, and from that point, change by giving them the practice.
I'm listening to a sales book. It's the Challenger sale, and the way that they describe it is that you have to. Well, this is like a new sales methodology. Well, it's not that new. It's from 2008, 2009, but that they say that the best salespeople they saw were challenging customers and were kind of like bringing them to some new sort of insight. But then they said that the one thing that you really should not do is show them a new insight, show them the problem, and not have a solution, because then basically you've brought them to the desert. And I think, yeah, probably that's what happens when you start talking about complexity, is that you bring them, they don't have an immediate resolution. So they feel like you've dropped them in the desert. And yeah. And that's not a fun thing.
Yeah. No.
So it is interesting.
I've been to the desert on a horse with no name then, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I like to quote some music stuff. Yeah, and I think, so in the training, I'm using training from the back of the room, and they actually say the same thing, right? You want them to explore it themselves. And like yesterday, I gave a training as well, and sometimes I feel a bit guilty because they're doing like this thing and I'm just hanging around there for 10, 15 minutes while they start discussing their own ideas. And that's nice, because during the teach back they give, they started discussing amongst them how it is. And that's what you want. Now you triggered them. Now they can resolve it for themselves. And you're just sometimes giving them that guidance and that methods or the practices to help deal with their situation.
That's not exactly what they're recommending in the sales book.
Oh.
But I think it's still a little bit more about, okay, so how am I going to make you buy my stuff?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
So thank you very much for joining us and for doing this together with us. It was a fascinating discussion. I took one of Ruth Malan's courses on recommendation of Marc. So the world of architects or complexity-aware architects has started to open for me, but there's still so much to learn. There's a lot of methodologies that you were talking about that I've heard like references to, but I haven't actually seen them in action yet. So there's so much to learn. Really, really interesting things.
Yeah, and I love, if there's one person to follow on Twitter, it's Ruth Malan, because she's just giving you an RSS stream of all the new stuff that's coming in, and she's so knowledgeable. So I learned a lot from her so far.
Thank you very much, Kenny. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
It's great.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
That's it for this episode. You can learn more about Kenny at Baasi.com. That's BAASIE.com. The Deliberate Complexity podcast arc is brought to you by Pronovix and Contextualise. You can learn more about our companies at pronovix.com and maturitymapping.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, make sure to mind the context.